Alrighty, in this video we are going to be talking about some really awesome extensions to object literals, and I'm also going to be pointing out a potential issue and a potential bug that you might run into. Let's go ahead and get started. As always, I have my HTTP server running on the public folder, and I have Babel watching in the background and compiling all my JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and take O3 deconstructing and copy and paste it. I'm just going to rename it to O4... just call this objects. Then O4 objects for the JS file. Still haven't needed jQuery yet, but that's okay. We'll still leave that include in there. Open up source scripts, right click, new file, O4 objects JS. Let's go ahead and do our self-executing function here so that we don't get any nasty messages from VS Code about potential conflicting variable names. And we'll console log something out and make sure that it is working, and it is. So let's go ahead and get started. So there's been a bunch of new bits of syntax we can use for objects or for creating objects in JavaScript now. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, for example, in our deconstructing, creating an object using a JSON, JavaScript object notation, where we supply a bunch of different properties inside of curly braces, and we can also supply arrays and literals and all that fun stuff. So for this, we're going to look at some of the fun other things we can do. First of all, one of the simple things that we can do is, let's say I have a function called, I don't know, get point or something. And at some point we have a, and let's say we actually compute this x value. So x equals 0, and then let y equal 0. And then we have something like compute xy, blah, blah, blah. So we set different values into those variables. And let's say we wanted to return an object that looked like this, x colon x, y colon y, right? So very common thing to do in JavaScript, where you pass along you create a new object, but you pass along the some variables into it that are the same name as the property you want that object to have. So instead of doing that, we can use a new feature where instead of doing a property followed by a colon, we just supply the property name itself. So I can do return xy. And now when I save this out, notice how in Babel, nothing changed. It's the exact same code. So that's because when you create a new object in JavaScript, or rather ECMAScript 2015, if you create an object and pass in a variable that has the same name as that you want to set the property to, then it'll go ahead and just generate that code for us. Very straightforward. I just want to point it out in the interest of completeness here. So it doesn't just have to be for simple cases like this. I can also go ahead and say const first name equals Nelson, and then I can say const person, and I'm going to go ahead and maybe open up a more complicated object declaration, and I'm just going to supply first name, hit Control S. And so you'll notice that I can mix and match. So I can say last name is Lakay, but for the first name I'm just supplying the name. All right, that's fun stuff. Next up is going to be basically what something we've already done in our code already inside of Node, and that is an easier way to declare functions on an object. So traditionally what we would do is we would have something like say hello, and we would say colon, and then we would open up a function, and then we would say console log something like this first name, this first name followed by this last name, right? So pretty straightforward string interpolation here. Pretty straightforward function that you might have normally used the syntax to add functions to your objects. The colon function is no longer necessary. So basically, in the interest of reducing the amount of code you have to write, you can now just, when you're declaring an object, completely remove the colon function. And when I hit Control S over here, you'll notice that Babel does completely transpile it into how it was before, but we no longer had to add that extra bit of syntax. So that really cleans up our objects. Now this also applies to defining properties. So this is actually an ECMAScript 5 feature that is available on pretty much every single browser at this point. Every single modern browser, that is. And I'll show the compatibility chart in a second. But it also applies to properties. So I can say it's something like a get full name and say return this first name followed by this last name. And you'll notice that this, in this case, the code will stay how it is, but it'll still be understood by modern browsers. And by modern browsers, if you pop open the little grid of compatibility over here, pop over to ECMAScript 5 and scroll down to getter and property initializer. So like the syntax we're just looking at, notice how it's green across the board. And of course, if you're worried about Internet Explorer, this only covers Internet Explorer 9, up to Internet Explorer 9. But really, unless you have to support Internet Explorer 8, some places do, some places don't. I wouldn't worry about that at all. Again, you're not required to use this feature if not supporting Internet Explorer 8 is an issue for you. Alrighty, there's a pretty much just one last feature that I wanted to talk about as far as new ways to work with object definitions in JSON in general, or not JSON, but in JavaScript, is computed property names. So for example, I can go ahead and say const thing. I'm running out of creativity, sorry guys. Const thing, and so we can always declare our properties as usual, like prop1 is whoa. But we can now do computed properties by using square bracket syntax. So I can say, I can create a property and I'll call it thing dash plus other, and then assign it to bleh. And now when I hit Control S, notice how Babel is doing actually some really interesting syntax gymnastics here to get this code to work properly. So let's look at the syntax over here on the left first. We can go ahead and we can declare properties with any arbitrary JavaScript that we want as the name. So I can use any variable, any function. You know, this isn't very useful, but I can also say plus math.random. Which is pretty silly thing to do, but I can do it if I wanted to, or any other variable or parameter or whatever. And so that's how the syntax looks. You just use square brackets, and then you stick whatever JavaScript expression you want inside of there. So very handy feature in really specific circumstances. I've only really ran into issues where I wanted to do computed properties and object literals. Not very often. Generally, what you would do if you ran into a situation on an older version of ECMAScript, you would then do something like thing and then open up square brackets and do computed dash plus property or whatever equals 10. You'd be forced to do something like this. This syntax simply allows us to do it inline in our object literal. But now let's look at the thing that Babel is doing, because we're going to see examples of Babel doing this quite frequently throughout this section. And that is, it's now using this underscore define property in order to declare both the object, and it's also passing in the new property that we want on it. And where does this define property function come from? Well, if we scroll up to the top of the file, we'll see that Babel actually inserted a define property function at the top that actually goes out and allows us to define that property in a way that happens at runtime. As opposed to using the object literal, because obviously this syntax is not valid ECMAScript 5 code, so it won't run natively on the browser. So Babel goes behind the scenes and adds some helper code at the top that is completely transparent to us. We don't have to worry about this code whatsoever. But it does it completely transparently and just does the right thing. So this starts to get into a situation where our code that's being rendered in Babel is starting to look a little bit different from the code that we originally wrote. And we're going to see examples of Babel doing some really crazy transformations later in this section. I did, however, notice a bug with Babel and using computed properties. Again, I don't use computed properties very often in object literals myself, but I did notice an interesting bug that is likely going to be fixed at some point, but might not be. So if you run into this very specific scenario, I'll show you how to fix it. So if I go ahead and say const thing 2, and let's go ahead and just do a getter real fast, a get property. I'll say this works, and it'll simply return works, right? So very straightforward. It's using the get syntax here again, which is valid for all modern browsers. But then let's say I do a computed property. And I say, and I do whoa, right? Oh, it just forgot to work again. There we go. And we see that does the same thing that it did up here with the define property. But then let's add a getter after that. Now what's going to happen is it's going to do something a little weird that's going to cause the code not to work. So if I go back into my my window and I refresh, you'll notice I get an error, uncaught reference error, this doesn't not defined. So it looks like there is a little bit of a bug between the whatever the transpiler itself is doing behind the scenes and what it's actually when it runs into one of these computed properties, it switches on to probably some sort of different mode of execution, and we're having an issue. So may or may not work on your guys' end, but it doesn't work here. But that's fine. We're not going to run into this very often. Yeah, there's really not a whole lot else to say about object literals. We got a couple new bits of syntax that we can use now, which is really cool. And I guess I'll just really leave it at that. And we'll see you guys in the next video.